They have a goddamn baby barbecue in numbers. Like, is all of this in line with Christian ethics? God says, go and slaughter the Amalekites, slaughter the men, the women, the children, the infants. What's the justification for that? Is that in line with Christian ethics?
That's a good question. That's a good question.
Does the Bible command genocide? Jordan Peterson was the latest person to be confronted with this accusation that the Bible has a war against Amalek that is just an unprovoked genocide.
It's God saying, go and do this atrocity. He commands the Israelites to genocide their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. That's not a just war at all.
And so often we see this online, the confidence with which somebody will attack a biblical idea or a Talmudic idea or a Jewish idea or whatever it is often wildly out of proportion to what the text itself says. That's putting it quite nicely. Welcome back to another episode of Rabbi Rowe Reacts. Well, if you do like this content, please do click the like button. That's good for the algorithm and good to know that you like it. Also, the subscribe button is a good one as well, but especially the notification one, so you get notified as content comes through. And also remember to comment if there's things you like, dislike, want to agree with, disagree with, or just ideas about future videos. Jordan Peterson recently took on 20 atheists in what has now become this channel called Jubilee, where they put people in a room with 20 people who strongly disagree with them, and there's a whole format and setup, and it's lots of people are taking on the challenge. And Jordan Peterson is one of them. The video was actually put together a few months ago. And he seemingly felt uncomfortable when the issue of Amalek came up. So by popular demand, a few of you showed me that video, knowing that I've done videos responding to the question of the ethics around the Amalek, or the unease we feel around the destruction of Amalek in the Bible and how we're meant to relate to it. So I'm going to be looking at this video and together with you and reacting to it. So before we dive in, I should say Jordan Peterson is very well known to many people, a psychologist who became very famous being willing to stand up for controversial views, especially conservative controversial positions, which has taken a toll on him. Recently, his daughter Michaela posted on X, unfortunately, there have been side effects to medication he'd taken, and he was having a really difficult time with mental health. So we wish him well. Mental health challenges of strong magnitudes can be really, really, really hellish, horrific for the person, horrific for their family members. And so we pray that he has a recovery together with all those who need a recovery, and that the family has strength to go through all this. So let's take a look at the clip. It takes place about an hour in. And the format is that whoever's this person in the hot seat, so to speak, makes a claim. And then people run to try and challenge them on the claim. And if the audience doesn't like what they're doing, they can raise red flags. And if enough people raise red flags, they get booted out and somebody else steps into their shoes. Let's take a look at the claim Jordan Peterson makes first.
Final claim is that atheists accept Christian morality, but deny the religion's foundational stories.
So the idea here is that biblical morality, let's say Christian morality, he wants to say change the world. It's seeped into society. And even as atheists kind of removed God and therefore removed the basis for this morality and removed belief in the Bible, they nevertheless won't form an alternative to it and will live with Christian morality. That's the theory, plausible, and we're going to see how the student immediately jumps in and attacks him. I shouldn't say student. I don't know if he's a student. Okay, this atheist jumps in and tackles him. So they're racing now.
Hi there.
It's very nice to meet you.
What's your name?
I'm Ian.
Hi, Ian.
Yes. So God says that you can own people as property. He says that you can beat them with a rod too. He commands genocide in Deuteronomy, in Numbers, and in Samuel. I mean, they have a goddamn baby barbecue in Numbers. Like, is all of this in line with Christian ethics?
No.
So then God doesn't fit within Christian ethics.
Well, the biblical library is a continuing story, and everything written in it has to be contextualized by the entire text. There's 65,000 hyperlinks in the biblical text. And you can take pieces of it out of context and criticize them, and that's what you're doing. But that's a mistake, I think. It's an analytic mistake because you're putting the cart before the horse.
I really don't think so. I think that if we say that something is Christian ethics, then I think that all of the books essential to Christianity would fit with it, especially if it's like the main character. When we're talking about
How do you deal with
God,
the morality of war?
So
How do you think you should deal with the morality of war?
Sure. Because I feel like the morality, like I feel like Christian ethics, like this is kind of, I guess I just think it's like kind of an absurdity to say that God doesn't fit within Christian ethics. But sure, well, we can go on my ethics. That's totally fine.
I don't know what you mean by an absurdity. What game are you playing with?
Well,
that
I just think
question?
that it's an absurdity to say that the Christian God doesn't fit within Christian ethics. That like the Christian God isn't like Christian ethical.
I said that the specific statements that you made don't take the context of the stories into account, and so that your analytical approach is faulty.
Sure.
Don't put words in my mouth.
Sure, then let's go through the example. Yeah, so, and I apologize. So let's go through the example. So in 1 Samuel 15:3, God says, go and slaughter the Amalekites, slaughter the men, the women, the children, the infants. What's the justification for that? Is that in line
That's a
with
good
Christian
question.
ethics?
That's a good question.
Okay, so he raised a lot of issues, and maybe in other videos I can respond to several of them, or all of them even, in his opening sentence. But he's now lasered in when Jordan Peterson has said, okay, so let's really focus in, and you're putting words in my mouth. I've said there should be context to the stories. So he's now lasering in on this chapter of Samuel, where God is telling via the prophet Samuel, the king Saul, to wipe out all of Amalek. And Jordan Peterson now says, that's a good question. So let's see how he responds, and let's follow the dialogue for a little bit longer.
I don't really know what to do with the terrible, blood-soaked, saturated history of the human past. I don't know. And I don't think anybody knows. I mean, what you try to do in your own life, as far as I can tell, is to conduct yourself in a manner that makes such things much more unlikely.
I totally agree.
We're all saddled with the problem of the catastrophes that got us here, aren't we?
Yeah, but this one was commanded by God. That's the problem.
Yeah,
That's what differentiates it from anything else, is that this one, it's God saying, go and do this atrocity.
Do you think that there's ever such a thing as a righteous war?
I'm skeptical. I'm not sure. It would probably be situational.
Well, right, fair enough.
But this one certainly wasn't a just war. The context for the Amalekite slaughter is that 400 years earlier, they fought one battle, which they lost, and God says, that's it, I'm going to wipe them off the face of the goddamn earth. And then 400 years later, he commands the Israelites to genocide their great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren. That's not a just war at all. And also, a genocide is not a war.
Well, a genocide can be a war, but...
Absolutely not.
Look,
the genociding of the Amalekites, the men, the women, and the infants, that's not a war. The infants aren't combatants.
Look, I already said that it's very difficult to look at the blood-soaked past and to know exactly what to do about it. The answer I gave to the gentleman who is sitting here before you is that it's necessary to read a text like the Bible at all of its levels of analysis simultaneously. And there's a directional morality that emerges across time, that has its roots in the Old Testament, for example, with its restrictions against murder specifically, that makes itself manifest in the Christian texts as the insistence on voluntary self-sacrifice as the foundational belief. That's a profoundly anti-violence ethos.
Do you have the belief in your theology?
Well, what do you think of that? Wait a sec. Now, redress what I just said.
So I'm about to address it, but I'm addressing it with a question. Do you think that God is, by his very essence, perfect?
You'll have to provide more.
Okay, so they go on now for a very long time. You can watch the video. It's online. I think we'll post it. Hopefully we'll post it in the link below. Now, a number of points. I think it seems to me that Dr. Peterson was not so comfortable with that. And the angle he was kind of taking is you need to see the Bible in its broad context. He himself struggles with the blood-soaked past of human history, which the Bible's within and a part of, and something along those lines. Now, I think the mismatch actually is, my understanding is that the way Jordan Peterson looks at the Bible is what's it telling us to do for the future, and since this is clearly not an instruction to be done ever again, it's one-off, so it's something he leaves to wrestle with in the struggles of the past. Also, he was alluding to a view that the biblical ideas that start as ideals in the Old Testament get to bigger fruition in the New Testament. You might have seen me do a video on this in the past also. I think we'll link it in the link below, of Dinesh D'Souza having this kind of argument against Alex O'Connor, and I did a reaction to that on this topic of Amalek, so you can look up that as well. And of course, this student Ian, again, I keep calling him a student, this guy Ian is an atheist, maybe he's a student, maybe he's a young working person, he seems quite young, but very smart, intelligent guy, pushes back and says, okay, fine, but at the end of the day, you want to tell me Christian ethics are so fantastic, or biblical ethics are so fantastic, they've got this God commanding this genocide. And now his understanding, interestingly enough, is there can be no justification for this war because the only reason for this war is they came and attacked the Israelites when they came out of Egypt 400 years earlier, and tried to attack them, lost the battle, and now God's saying, now I want their great-great-grandchildren wiped out. Now, I'll show you where he gets that from in the text, and I'm going to show you that he's mistaken. And then I want to really spend a few minutes dealing with this question, because it is a big question. It comes up quite often. So let's first look at where Ian's getting this from. So in the beginning of what we call Shmuel Aleph, or 1 Samuel chapter 15, in verse 1 it says that the prophet Samuel comes to King Saul and says, I've been sent by God, and this is what God says, right? Verse 2. I'm going to now, I've remembered, or I'm going to punish, or whatever it is, that which Amalek did to Israel, that they attacked him on the way out of Egypt, and now go and smite Amalek. So this is where Ian's coming from. He's saying, look, they're literally being punished now for what they did hundreds of years earlier. This is hundreds of years later. And then it literally says, don't have mercy, knock out man and woman, children, animals, everything. And in fact, in the story, what happens, they go to war, and afterwards King Saul leaves alive Agag, the king of the Amalekites, and Samuel comes and tells him it's such a terrible thing he did, and personally kills him, and the implication is therefore every single Amalekite had now been killed, and that's how it's normally understood. Now, this is actually missing an enormous amount of what's going on in the story. So I want to spend a few minutes just going through the story of Amalek in general, who they were, why God's asking them to be killed. Second of all, what is God actually commanding versus what he's not commanding? And third of all, what might the justification be? Well, they're going to be all interlinked. But let's start with the story of Amalek. So yes, the very first episode we have with Amalek is in the book of Exodus, Shemos chapter 17, where the Israelites have come out of Egypt, and they're traveling through the Sinai desert, and seemingly with no provocation whatsoever, we read about how Amalek just came and attacked them. The verse just says, Amalek came, battled against Israel in a place called Rephidim. Moses is told by God to go up to send Joshua into battle, and he himself has to go up to the mountain close to God, and they defeat Amalek, and then God says, there's going to be in every generation a battle between Amalek against me. So Amalek is not just trying to destroy Israel. Amalek's, if you like, perfect original anti-Semitism, desire to annihilate the nation of Israel, is actually a war against God, interestingly enough. And that's repeated in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 19, that says you should wipe out, now the Hebrew word is Zecher Amalek, which is usually translated into English as the memory of Amalek. Very strange thing to do. How do you wipe up the memory of Amalek? Especially because the Torah says never forget what they did to you. And so there's different commentaries. Some say it means there will come a time when you actually have to wipe them out in the war referred to in Samuel. But Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, one of the great commentaries of 2 centuries ago, the 19th century, actually proves from there that it means wipe out the ideology or kingdom of Amalek, not necessarily to wipe out every individual. In other words, God says there's this horrific ideology in the world of killing all the Jews, trying to get rid of God, and you're going to have to remove that ideology from the world. But it doesn't end there. It carries on in the book of Judges, for example. They become this mortal enemy of Israel. It's not they did something once and never again. They are in every generation trying to annihilate the Israelites, massacre them wherever they can. So, for example, in Judges 3, verse 13, we read that the Ammonites are at war against Israel. Guess who comes to join them, take advantage of the situation and massacre Jews? The Amalekites. In Judges chapter 6, you see the same thing. This time the Midianites are coming to, once again, the Amalekites. And it's perpetually like this. Every time there's a weakness, every time there's a vulnerability, they are there. Every time an enemy attacks, they are there. They are perpetually slaughtering Israelites and killing them. And this goes on for hundreds of years, during which time Israel has presumably tried everything from diplomacy to military defense, and nothing is working. Generation after generation, they are slaughtering and slaughtering Israelites, and now it all comes to the fore. So when God sends Samuel to King Saul and says, I remember what they did when they came out of Egypt, he's not saying this happened once 400 years ago and that's it. This has been continuous since then, 4 centuries of slaughtering Israelites. And now we're going to finally come up with a new strategy. Now, those familiar with Jewish legal sources and so on will be familiar. There's a mitzvah, there's a fulfillment of a biblical command to go to war against Amalek and to actually do what was done in the book of Samuel. However, let's be very, very clear. There is no biblical command to ever have a war and that's it. The biblical command is always to follow what it says in Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 10, which is that when you go to a city to fight, and by the way, I'll come to this in a minute, but biblical wars are always against the city, not against the wider population. I'll explain why that is soon. But when you go to a city to fight, you have to always call out in peace. You have to try and negotiate a peace with them. And the peace does not mean they have to all become Israelites. It means they have to agree to stop slaughtering Israelites. It means they have to agree to some very basic tenets that we call the Noahide law. In the ancient world, that was quite hard because people killed their own children. That violates the Noahide law of you shall not murder. There was often unjust systems of unequally applied law. That violates the Noahide law. But so these basic, what we call basic ethical monotheism, a few fundamental ethical principles, they're willing to live under them. They're willing to stop trying to kill you and attack you. That would have been it. And Maimonides writes this explicitly in the 6th chapter of the Laws of Kings and Wars. This applies for Amalek. This applies for all the wars that the Torah talks about. You first have to try to negotiate peace. So people ask, well, how do you then destroy Amalek? That's the answer. If you can destroy them ideologically by allowing them to say we're going to stop trying to slaughter you, we're going to end our war against God and our constant attempt to annihilate the Jewish people, at that moment Amalek is gone. The ideology of Amalek is over. That's all you need to do. You don't have to do it in battle. In fact, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, perhaps the greatest halachic authority of the mid to late 20th century, wrote in an important legal analysis that there's only one time they were ever instructed to actually go to war. Why? Isn't that biblical command to end Amalek? And he says no, the actual command to go to war has to be instructed directly from God himself. So how do you wipe out Amalek? Presumably, like Maimonides says, you try and do it through ideology, through persuasion, through other means, and once they get told to go to war. Okay, so now let's analyze the war itself, right? Ian characterized it the way, to be fair to him, the most natural reading of the text is it's a war to wipe out every man, woman, or child in the whole of Amalek. That sounds like a genocide. Now, you could ask an interesting moral question. Could God himself, creator of the universe, instruct something that to us is the most morally repugnant thing? Maybe morally and spiritually you could answer yes. God is the creator of the universe. He thinks everybody into existence. He's the one who gives us our moral instincts in the first place. God may see something we don't see and instruct us to do something that it feels morally horrific or repugnant to us. Theologically, you could probably say yes to that. However, as we're going to see, that's not what's actually going on in this story. Of course, you'd have to be extremely sure that this is really God talking to you and not you just having dreams or hallucinations. But as we're going to see, that's a theoretical question, a very important one, but not one that's going on in this story. How do we know? Because if that was the instruction, remember the story. King Saul fails, but he only fails to kill one person, King Agag. Samuel comes the next day and kills Agag. There's a tradition that during the night, Agag found a woman, maybe in prison with him or whatever, and impregnated her, and so the seed carried on. But that would mean that at that moment in time, there was nobody left alive in the whole of Amalek. Well, if all you had was Samuel chapter 15, you might think so, but if you actually read the Bible a few chapters later, chapter 27 and chapter 30, you will see there are an enormous amount of Amalekites, enough to keep raiding and destroying cities. The town of Ziklag is destroyed. David, who will become king of Israel, is fighting against them, battling against them. And it's only a few years, only as little as 2 years later. So quite clearly, our naive, simple reading is wrong. This was not a war that destroyed all of Amalek. So what is it? If you look at the classical biblical commentaries that we use, there's very little discussion of this. I'm going to give you something which is somewhat speculative in that I haven't seen a source for it inside, but I think it rigidly works with the text and is the best explanation for what we're seeing over here. And that is that in the ancient world, there is always an ambiguity as to whether we're talking about a city or a civilization. Let me explain. Civilizations in the ancient world were as follows. The majority of people lived in the hinterlands, in the wider areas, and the city controlled that area. When that city became imperial and conquered other cities, the whole empire could be named for that city. So you have an Assyrian empire based around the city Assyria, Babylonian empire around the city Babylon, the Roman empire around the city Rome, and so on. So if someone were to say we're going to war to destroy Assyria, they might mean the whole of the Assyrian empire, or they might mean the central city. It's always a little bit ambiguous, and that's true of the war against Amalek too. Is it to destroy everybody in Amalek, or is it to destroy everyone in the city? Okay, but that still sounds pretty horrible, right? Well, let's think, how big were cities? Cities like Rome were gigantic. Babylon and Assyria were enormous. But Amalek, which was essentially a nomadic population, had tiny cities, more like what we would call today a citadel. How do we know? We found it archaeologically. We found the one or two candidate places that could be the city of Amalek. One is called Tel Massos. It's about 15 kilometers north of Beersheba, both ancient Beersheba and the modern town as well. And it's one of two main candidate places for what would be called Amalek, literally translated city of Amalek, but really citadel. It's got about 10 buildings of about 4 rooms each. So there's about 40 rooms in this whole city. Essentially, if this was the central urban point of Amalek, it would have been a royal residence with a few royal families, some servants, maybe 1 or 2 senior administrators like a high priest or something like that. It's a tiny number of people. The other prime candidate is called Tel Ed Kuderat, is literally about 75 or 70 meters by 40 meters. Again, we'd be talking really about a royal citadel. So this war to destroy Amalek is ambiguous. Is it to destroy everybody in the entire population, as Ian said, a genocide? Or is God saying, no, destroy the royal citadel? Well, let's take a look inside the text. In verse 5, King Saul comes. It says, King Saul came to the citadel of Amalek and camped in the valley. Now, obviously, if you're going to attack the citadel, it's like going into the beehive. The entire military is going to come and defend it, and it's going to be a very big war. But that's only going to be a war against soldiers who afterwards are going to flee if they get defeated and go home. The actual commandment to kill man, woman, and child is referring apparently to the royal family based in Amalek, the citadel of Amalek. Why? To fulfill the biblical command of destroying the ideology of Amalek. But what justifies that? Why not just go after the king? So once again, let's remember, they've been going at this for 400 years. They've probably tried that before, and it hasn't worked. You see, in the ancient world, people weren't as individual as today. Right? People's consciousness was much more the tribe they're in, and their identity was tied to the local tribal family, the chieftain family. If that family is still alive, the ideology will sustain itself, and in this case, it's the sickest ideology. Amalek is an ideology of constantly trying to massacre and murder Israelites and get rid of God in the world. So that's who they are. How do you end that? They've tried everything for hundreds of years. They've tried defending themselves. They've tried diplomatic measures. They've tried working with peace. They've tried war. Nothing's worked. And in desperation, God says, okay, I'm going to tell you what's going to work. If you eliminate the whole royal family, why? Because so long as one child remains, the population will wait for them. That's not just, by the way, my speculation. You see that in the biblical text, precedent for this. For example, in Judges chapter 9, Gideon's children, one is called Avimelech, and he wipes out his family, but one child is hidden and survives, and he's later able to announce a revolt in which Avimelech is deposed. Chapter 11, the queen Asalia, who assassinates the entire family, one child is hidden, Josiah, Yoshiahu, and because of that he's able later to come back and the people will work with him to overthrow her. So keeping one child alive means the ideology stays alive. And so without a divine commandment we could not do this, but after centuries of effort, God intervenes and says, really sorry, I'm telling you this is the right thing to do, even if it feels morally problematic to you, is to completely destroy everything associated with the citadel, including its livestock, everything, so that the people will then be able to move on ideologically, and you will destroy the ideology of Amalek for once and for all. Saul waged the war, and he kept alive one man, the king Agag. The next day Samuel came and killed him, but the seed of Amalek was alive. So was an enormous amount of the population, because there had not been a command, apparently, to wipe out all the men, women, and children of the whole population. This was not apparently a command of genocide. It was apparently a command to destroy the citadel and the royal family so that the rest of the population that survived would no longer be Amalek, but become something else, thereby fulfilling the biblical instruction of getting rid of that ideology from the world. Now, that may still raise moral questions, but it's a completely different question to the one that Ian was pushing against Jordan Peterson. And I don't blame Jordan Peterson for not being so familiar with a lot of the things I was saying, but he is correct when you look at the whole thing in context of who Amalek is all the way through, in context of how the ancient world operated, in context of exactly what is said, and in context of the fact that Amalek is clearly left alive and not killed, and nobody criticizes King Saul for leaving the masses of Amalek alive. When you put it all into context that way, especially in the context of Deuteronomy and the obligation to call out in law, the context of how Maimonides codifies the law, the context of the teachings that I quoted, then it does become an extremely different question. A rabbi I really respect once said, if you feel there's a struggle between biblical ethics, God's divine command, and our own inner sense of morality, usually it's because we either didn't understand the biblical story correctly, or we didn't understand ethics correctly and have to investigate whether our moral intuitions really are as accurate as we think they are, or very often we just didn't understand both. So whilst we are absolutely committed to whatever it is the creator of the universe says, that's the ultimate authority, in this particular case, a study of all the biblical context suggests that the command is to destroy the ideology. In one moment of time, it became a command to wipe out the entire royal family. Only after 4 centuries of doing everything else possible, the command was not adhered to. The seed of Amalek remained in the world, and centuries later, in the later biblical text, they're still trying to annihilate and destroy the entire nation of Israel. So I don't expect that either Ian or Jordan Peterson would necessarily be so aware of either of those things that I've just shared with you right over here. But I do think Jordan Peterson is correct about this point, that you do need to look at the biblical story in its broader context to understand exactly what's going on. Either way, Sancherib came along, destroyed all the nations around, and there's not been an actual nation called Amalek in the world for many, many centuries. However, in the Kabbalistic text, the Kedushas Levi, for example, and the Hasidic works, talk about how Amalek is a certain evil that exists all over the world. Sometimes it will manifest in a culture that comes to kill you, and you have to defend yourself and be willing to defend yourself against them. Often it manifests in it as an inner evil too, and our war to destroy Amalek is often an internal war to destroy our own inner evil within us, thereby lighting up the whole world. As for Peterson's broader point that the biblical ethics are the ethics that have changed civilization and humanity, I have videos on that topic too. It is correct. And his broader point, I believe, is 100% right. The biblical text transformed civilization, radically changed the value system of mankind in everything from the glorification of peace instead of war, justice instead of hierarchy, and many other items. Education of every child, social responsibility, the infinite value of every life, all these sorts of things which I speak about in other videos. If you do like this content, please do remember to like, to subscribe, to click the notification button. Also feel free to comment below, and look forward to seeing you next time. Until then, may God bless you all.